Perfect. Okay, so we're going to officially start. So welcome everyone to the Library Publishing Coalition webinar on copyright and Creative Commons publishing with open licenses. This is part of a series of webinars from the LPC's Professional Development Committee. And I'm Barbara DeFleece. I'm a Program Director for Scholarly Communication, Copyright, and Publishing at Dartmouth College. And I'm a member of LPC's Professional Development Committee. I'm joined by Rhonda Marker, who's the Director of Shared User Services at the Rutgers University Libraries, and she's also a member of the LPC Professional Development Committee. Our expert source, as you can tell, of insights into the use of Creative Commons for publishing is Meredith Jacob, who's the Public Lead for Creative Commons USA. She'll give us a short presentation, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So a couple logistics. I'll moderate the session, and Rhonda's going to monitor the chat so we can address your questions when Meredith finishes her presentation. We're also joined by Ethan Senek, Outreach and Policy Manager of Creative Commons USA, and he'll help monitor the chat and assist with questions as needed. So a couple more important things. This is being recorded. Melanie Schlosser is handling that, but we will turn off recording when questions start. When we get to the question part, I'll remind everybody about this again, but remember to unmute yourself if you speak. The audio questions and answers will not be recorded, but the chat, which we hope you use very actively right now, is archived, but will not be made public when the recording of the presentation is released. And we'll make sure that everybody understands the chat questions by having them be repeated or summarized by the moderator. Finally, if you have technical issues, a couple of ways to get help are to send a private chat on the system to Melanie Schlosser, and you'll see her name in the list of participants, or an email directly to her at melanie@educopia.org. And I do want to recognize Melanie for her great work in helping us put this session together. So over to Meredith.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys. And very excited to hear about, in the questions a little bit, what you guys are doing in your work. As was just introduced, I'm the public lead for Creative Commons United States, and I'm joined by Ethan Senek, who does a lot of our policy and outreach and community building work. So we said these slides would not take up too much of the webinar, and there are 30 of them. So what I'm trying to do is sort of start with a base just to make sure we're all on the same page. So I'm going to go through the initial slides relatively quickly. But one of the things I found, even with people who work with Creative Commons licenses day in, day out in the work they do, there are sometimes incomplete parts of the framework of understanding sort of how the licenses work, how they exist within the framework of copyright, and what the options in the different license types are. So I'm going to run through that quickly before we focus in on some questions that are really specific to the publishing context. The other thing I'll say is, having spent the last 2 years talking to a lot of teachers and professors and educators, I'm aware of how bad the pedagogy is to sit here and run through 30 slides at the rate of about a slide a minute. So please do feel free, if you have questions throughout the presentation, to go ahead. I've actually figured it out so I can see the chat even though I'm presenting. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask them during the presentation to break that up a little bit too. And these slides are on SlideShare. I put that link in earlier, but I'll put it again now. So if you want to be able to take notes or click on links throughout the presentation, they're there. So what we'll cover very briefly is what open educational resources are, because open textbooks, open scholarly monographs, and other publishing materials like that are a type of open educational resource. How are they the same and different as sort of traditionally published materials? What makes them different in the copyright and licensing side? A basic overview of copyright to show how this fits within the copyright system. And then the advantages of using an open license and the steps towards authorship in that context. And then reserving a good chunk of the time, at least 20 or 25 minutes, to discuss questions that you may have, and then discuss questions we are frequently asked. So open educational resources are any type of educational material that are released under an open copyright license rather than a traditional all rights reserved license. This takes advantage of the ability to have digital distribution and authorship, to increase public access at a cost savings, and improve the ability to remix and translate these materials. A lot of the discussion around OER has started with open textbooks, but is expanding to include other sorts of scholarly materials, including monographs, simulations, videos, and in a lot of ways is moving to meet other open movements that have sort of formerly been siloed, including open access publishing in the scientific journal and scholarly literature field, and open data. So like traditional textbooks or monographs, OER can be books. They can include slides, images, videos, simulations, or problem sets. The difference is that they're released under an open copyright license, a Creative Commons license that allows users to update and remix, to translate, to share new versions, and to post and distribute online. And these open licenses function within the copyright system. So our next step is sort of understand what the baseline copyright system provides. So copyright law grants to the author or copyright owner a set of exclusive rights, and they're the rights to do things with the book. So it's to reproduce, to make derivatives of, to sell, to distribute, to perform or display publicly, which may be a little less likely in your context, but maybe you guys have some playwrights, to distribute to the public, and to do any other uses that are protected by the Copyright Act. So this is subject to some specific exceptions, and then also subject to fair use, which is a broad limitation to copyright. Copyright owners can assign any or all of these rights to copyright, or they can give a limited license for others to make specific use of their work. So traditionally, when you want to use a copyrighted work, you either have to fit within an exception to copyright, or you need to get a license. So copyright protects anything that's an original work of authorship. So common things protected by copyright are books, articles, photographs, works of visual art, musical works. And for the last 25 years or so, copyright has been automatic. So it applies as soon as the work has been created. So even though people will sometimes still add the Circle C copyright logo, there's actually no need to do that anymore. And conversely, having not done that in no way reduces the copyrightedness of the thing you've created. Another important thing to remember about copyright is it lasts very, very long. It lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years or 95 years for an institutional author. And then after that time period has expired, the work will fall into the public domain and is free from those copyright restrictions. So one question is often, are there limits to what copyright protects? So copyright does not protect concepts, names, logos, inventions, or ideas. These are things that are either protected by patent or trademark law. So patent protects inventions, trademark law protects logos and other pieces of brand identity, whereas some things like ideas are intentionally left unprotected by intellectual property law. No field of intellectual property law would protect an idea or concept. The principle being that those things are not, that the public interest is not suited by restricting the ability to use or rely on an idea. So copyright in that area protects the specific expression of a work, the words, and possibly the structure, but it does not protect the underlying idea. And this may come into play when you're working with authors, because it's particularly important to distinguish for people the difference between ideas of plagiarism and academic integrity, which are about citing to the sources of your ideas and being intellectually and academically honest about that, which is a non-legal issue. It's an issue of professional ethics and of scholarly expectations, from the idea of copyright, which says you can completely use ideas and concepts from other authors or other researchers as long as you're not using their expression. So it's important to understand, I think, both in your own work and when you're advising authors, that while citation and attribution are very important in ethics and in scholarly integrity, they are not a question of copyright or copyright infringement. So if you had written a new work that referenced extensively the ideas of other authors but did not copy their exact expression, you could still easily, for example, release that work under an open license while still needing to attribute to those sources for your academic or scholarly responsibility. The other large exception that we have in the United States is fair use. So fair use allows the use of copyrighted work without permission from the copyright holder in specific circumstances. Fair use is a flexible four-factor test that focuses on the nature of the work you're using, the purpose and character of your use, the impact on the market, and the amount used. And so fair use is evaluated on a case-by-case basis and considers the purpose of the use. Sorry, there's context just went there. But it's important to remember that fair use is an important part of the law and is relied on by publishers, by media producers, by large industry. And so fair use, while it is specific and case by case, is not something that should be viewed as unreliable. Open licenses also work within the copyright system. So in traditional copyright, the author will hold the copyright to their work, and a license would be negotiated one-to-one. So if I've written a book and Ethan wants to use a section of that book, but not the rest because he thinks it's really bad, so he wants to use the one good chapter, he would have to write me and say, hey, I'd like to use get a license to use this chapter in my new book. And that would be a one-to-one thing, and I'd have my lawyers call his lawyers. But the open licenses work in a different way. They work as a license from one person to the public. And so the open licenses say, I will give anyone the license to use my work as long as they follow the terms of the license. And in the Creative Commons licenses, the terms of the license at their most basic for the Creative Commons by license is the requirement for attribution. So what are the advantages of this? As we said earlier, it takes advantage of digital distribution and authorship. If everyone had to work within a large publishing house framework, then the ability to do a one-to-many public license wouldn't matter as much, because the ability of other people to be new authors or to create new compilations didn't really exist before the digital publishing framework. So it takes advantage of that and allows for the fact that many people who you may never meet or never know or never imagine their specific use case will still be able to access your materials over the internet and have the ability to create new versions. It improves the ability to remix and translate, and it makes all sorts of informal reuse formally permissible and therefore possible to share on the internet. One of the tricky things about talking about the Creative Commons licenses is you go out and you talk to teachers and professors and people of all different sorts who've spent time collaborating on teaching materials and pulling together research materials, and they say, you're telling me I can remix like that's a new thing, right? People have always done remix, but what the open licenses do is they say, this isn't some tolerated use that you can only share within a closed community. This license gives you the official formal copyright permission to do that, and therefore means that you can share what you've done, this valuable new thing you've created, back on the open internet. So what do the Creative Commons licenses do? They clearly communicate to the public that this resource is free to reuse. There's a lot of material out there, particularly I think in academic and scholarly communities, in teaching communities, that the original author would actually be happy to share if asked, but most people don't have the time or don't really have the initiative to go and ask on a one-to-one basis. And so this is a billboard up front saying this is something you can reuse. It grants to the public that reliable license so that people who do take you up on the license and use it have a legally enforceable right to do it, so that you can't sort of have the rug yanked out from you later if you take a Creative Commons material and you build it or incorporate it into your materials. And then it provides a real requirement that those people who use openly licensed materials do something. That at the basic Creative Commons attribution license, the CC BY license, there's the requirement that the licensee gives attribution. And that's not a request, it's a legal requirement of the license. And so it is important to remember that this is a license that gives something, the ability to use, and requires something in exchange. There are 5 things that we talk about as the 5 R's that are both necessary for good teaching and learning and permitted by the Creative Commons licenses. They are to retain copies. So I know many different institutions in different contexts are dealing with subscription services as opposed to purchased ones now. So whether that's access to textbooks or access to scholarly journals, access is on a subscription basis. And so things that are openly licensed in contrast, you can always retain a copy. It allows for a wide variety of reuse, so there aren't limits on the types of use. It allows for revisions, which can be adapting, modifying, or improving. It also allows to combine sources and to then redistribute those updated or differentiated versions to the public. As many of you may know, there's a whole set of Creative Commons licenses. We've been talking about the Creative Commons Attribution license as the basic license, but there are other license terms, and so we're going to talk about those very briefly. The first license requirement is attribution. So all of the Creative Commons licenses except the CC0 license require attribution. And the things to note about that is that attribution is generally required to be where other copyright information would be. And it also allows you in the most recent version of the license, in the Creative Commons 4.0 licenses, to request specifically how you would like attribution to be given. And we see this sometimes in situations where if a work is funded by an institution, the institution may be the copyright owner, but in the attribution, they would like to name both the institution and the authors. Or you may see it in a situation where a work is funded by a grant funder, and the grant funder would like to be included in the attribution. So there you would attribute to the authors and the grant funder. The other 3 terms, non-commercial, share-alike, and no derivatives, are terms that limit the permissions otherwise given under the Creative Commons Attribution license. And there are times when those limits are really appropriate, but I would also challenge everyone to think about those limits with a fair amount of skepticism, because I think there's a lot of situations in which people embrace either a non-commercial, a share-alike, or a no derivatives limitation on a Creative Commons work out of a hope to sort of keep imagined bad people from doing imagined bad things. And there is some potential for those terms to do that, but in our experience talking to people about that, they have much more power actually to keep careful, well-intentioned people uncertain about what they can do. So the non-commercial license term says that other people can copy, distribute, display, or perform for all these purposes as long as it is for a non-commercial purpose. And one of the things we've seen there is there are these materials that have been created that are very useful, they're valuable, people love them, but they're limited in their ability to then distribute them because a lot of large-scale distribution ends up having a commercial step. So there was a litigation in the US in the last 2 years about whether or not school districts who wanted to have materials printed at a FedEx, so at a commercial printer, whether that was a commercial use. So, so far those cases have all held that that wasn't a commercial use, but that type of uncertainty, when there is a commercial step in a nonprofit's distribution model, I think that'll continue to sort of plague the non-commercial license term. And so I would encourage people to use a little bit of caution there. Similarly, the share-alike license term requires that any derivative works that are created from the original work are also released under the same Creative Commons license. And this is a model that is similar to, but in some ways actually more aggressive than some of the free software viral license models. The tricky thing about the share alike license is it not only requires that the new product be released under a Creative Commons license, it requires that it be released under the exact same license. And so this can lead to compatibility issues when, for example, you are trying to combine something that was under a CC BY SA and C license and a CC BY SA license. Both of those would demand that the daughter work be released under their own license, but because there's two licenses there, it's impossible to do that. As a caveat, many types of compilations that are more like playlists or syllabi or mixtapes, as they were, are not actually necessarily derivative works, and so the need to have a single license doesn't exist. So some people, I think, actually talk themselves into more share-alike problems than they have, but it's another reason, I think, to pick the most open, most basic license that you think is compatible with your goals. The final license term is a no derivatives term, which is generally excluded by people who work in open education and open access as not really being viewed as open for those purposes, because it doesn't allow any modification of the work. Primarily, we see no derivatives licenses on artistic works, particularly photography, where there's more of a sort of investment in the integrity of the whole. So here are the license types that play out from those conditions. You can see how the license types can combine. And they sort of go in this chart from most to least restrictive. In addition to that, we have the public domain mark, which is, unlike the licenses, not something that necessarily is attached by the author or the copyright holder, but is instead meant to mark things that are in the public domain, because while something may be in the public domain because the copyright has expired, there's no way to see that in the sort of in the object in the copyrighted work. And so this is a way to mark things that you know are in the public domain. The next license is the CC0 license, which is something that is put on by the author, but is often used for things like data, where copyright is either uncertain or in some rare instances could be used if you don't even need an attribution. In the dataset example, that's often because attribution in combined data sets can actually be fairly complicated. And then the last public domain mark is for things that weren't eligible for copyright, such as government works and things like that. So this is the basic CC license mark, and this is how you would mark a work. I'm sure everyone here has seen this. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. Except for otherwise noted, this work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0. It's important to include, if there's any outside materials, this clause that says except for otherwise noted, because if you do include third-party materials, as we'll talk about a little bit later, you want to be clear that they are not governed by the CC license. So this is the license mark. It links to the human readable version of the license that tells people what they can and cannot do, and then is backed up by the full legal text. So here we've sort of gone through our basics of CC licenses and how they work in copyright. So I'm just going to take a moment, and if we have any questions, anyone wants to drop them in the chat. I see the institutional author question, which is correct. I don't see any others, so I'm going to count to 10. Anyone can type fast, and then we'll go on to the next slides. See no typing. I'm not going to waste your time, but think about your questions. And so this is the basics for the CC licenses. And now what I want to talk about a little bit is how are they being used in large-scale sort of enterprise contexts. And while I know this group works on a mix of teaching and learning materials such as textbooks and then also scholarly monographs, we've seen a lot of progress recently in the open textbook field. So there's OpenStax, which is printing and delivering print copies and online copies of openly licensed CC BY licensed textbooks with a goal of covering the 40 most enrolled college courses. There's the Open Textbook Library that has a more distributed approach, but is also working at providing textbooks for the majority of college courses. Within that, they use this standard marking, which would show the copyright information and then the link to the resource. This is how you would attribute them. We've talked about the advantages, so I'm going to skip that just to keep moving. And so now we'll talk about some questions about implementation. So what rights does the author retain? So when authors come to you and you discuss possibly using an open license, there's a question of, well, am I just giving everything away? And I think it's really important to be honest that you are not giving everything away, that the author does retain some rights, but you are giving away a big amount of your ability to exclude other people. So things the author retains is the right to be attributed as the author. They also retain the ability to sign separate commercial contracts. So just because one of your authors has published something under an open licensing agreement does not actually legally limit their ability to publish it commercially with a publisher. It may, of course, limit the publisher's interest, but it doesn't change their ability to sign a separate contract that would run in parallel that would allow the publisher to publish that material. It would, however, dictate what terms could be in that contract. So many publishing contracts include that the publisher is getting an exclusive license, and an author who has licensed something under an open license, which is an irrevocable license, can't then turn around and give a publisher an exclusive license because they have already given a license to the public. They can give the publisher a non-exclusive license, but that will be a change to many standard publishing contracts. And that sort of leads into the question of, can content still be commercialized? The answer to that is yes. Whether or not the author chooses a CC BY license or a CC BY and C license, they can always commercialize their own content. And that could be through sales of print copies, through any other traditional method of commercialization, but with the knowledge that they are still, in a way, competing with their own free version under the license. So one question we've gotten a lot is talking about materials that contains or builds on existing copyrighted content. A lot of scholarly work that has to include either reference images or illustration will have that question. So you can include either a licensed photo or a passage as long as the license includes permission to distribute the work under an open license. The proprietary software combination is probably not an issue for most of the LPC community, but that is another issue, is whether you're distributing open data in a format that can only be read by proprietary software programs. Oh, there's a question. I don't know if I can see it.
So there's a question back on the marking slide. There's a traditional copyright symbol.
Sure. So the question was, why would you put the traditional copyright symbol? So there's actually no contradiction there, because the CC license is a license you give to the public after you've marked something, after you've created it. So it is possible that someone would want to register a copyright in something, or may have registered it before they put their open license in it. You don't actually have to register to get the mark, but if you have registered, you need the mark to get your remedies. But the issue would be, there's no contradiction between saying, I have copyrighted this, and I am the copyright holder, and I have marked it as such. And so it might be, in this case, an organizational policy to say we mark all our work. And then saying, once we have that copyright, we are giving a license to use it to the public under these Creative Commons terms. So adding the C doesn't actually do very much, but many people do it as a matter of institutional practice. And there's really no contradiction saying, this is copyrighted, I am the copyright holder, and then I do give this license to the public.
And I think a lot of folks, when they see the sort of copyright C, they associate it with all rights reserved. But just having the C on there does not infer that it is all rights reserved.
Yeah, it just asserts that it's copyrighted. But it's a good question, thank you. Okay.
Here's another question for you.
Another question. Okay, so is there any requirement that there be a second written agreement between an author and a publisher authorizing the use of a Creative Commons license? I'm going to hold that question for just 2 more slides because we have a couple examples there, and then I will answer it, but that's a good question. So we're talking about creating open textbooks or open monographs. It's important to remember that you can create open equivalents for proprietary materials. So ideas covered in proprietary materials aren't protected by copyright. And in textbooks and monographs, you can often include short excerpts for illustration, criticism, or review under fair use. And including fair use materials does not in any way bar you from then distributing that material with a Creative Commons license. You just need to be very clear about what material is yours and what material you have included pursuant to fair use. And you need to be, I think, sort of rigorous and precise in your determination of what you think fair use covers. So talking about authorship, we had the question about, do you need a separate agreement? Before we get to that, one question is, if you have an author, if you have an institution that's paying an author, or you're functioning as a publisher, normally you would have an author agreement. We've created a model author agreement that we created with the Open Textbook Network for institutions where faculty members or others are going to be authoring openly licensed materials, which talks about questions like who will hold copyright? Is it the author of the institution? Who will be responsible for any updating or versioning, the author, institution, and what license would be used? So that's linked in this slide, and you can also see it here. It's like a traditional publishing agreement, but includes the open requirement. And some more information about open publishing is often also on the Open Textbook Network website here. So now we're going to go to questions, and maybe? Okay. So the question about, is there any requirement there be a second written agreement between an author and a publisher authorizing the use of Creative Commons license? So what you have a question there is an order of question about what order things happen in. So if you have an author who has written a manuscript and it is first published through a commercial publisher, they have probably signed an agreement with that publisher that either transfers copyright to the publisher or, probably more likely, gives the publisher an exclusive right. If that original publishing contract has given the publisher an exclusive right to the work, so an exclusive right to publish the work, then yes, you would need a new follow-on agreement that would allow the author to use a Creative Commons license, because the author has given away the whole bundle of rights. They've given the exclusive right to that publisher. And so you would need a second thing to undo that and then give the author back the ability to give the Creative Commons license. If it's happened in the other order, so if the author wrote a manuscript and published it online with the Creative Commons license, and then that same work was going to be published under a traditional publishing contract, it would just be important to be clear in the publishing contract that you weren't granting an exclusive license, because you have already granted a license in that work to the public under the Creative Commons license. Does that answer your question on the sort of publishing contract question? I think that was from Joshua. Great. And then the next question is, for Creative Commons photographs, how do you find out who is to attribute? Often it's not on the photograph, and what's the penalty and how is it handled? Okay, so my first question would be, where are you finding the Creative Commons photographs? So if you're finding them on Flickr or something like that, and the structure is that the author of the photographs is uploading them, then you can attribute to the username. So example, in Flickr, often people use usernames and not real names. And so if that is on the platform and they have no separate attribution instructions, you can attribute to that and include the link back to that page. So one of the aspects of attribution is to include the link to where you found it. And so you would do that way. If you found it with a CC license, but no listed author, I'd be a little bit cautious. I don't know where that would be, but if you have examples, I'm happy to look at them. If there is no attribution, then you technically haven't complied with the license, and so you are where you would have been otherwise. So it's important to distinguish imperfect attempts at attribution from no attribution. So if I link to your picture from Flickr and I link back to the page the picture was on and I include your Flickr username, but I don't see that in the text you'd written and requested a different attribution, there's actually space in the new licenses for fixing good faith errors in attribution. So if you got in touch with me and said, hey, I asked that you attributed my real name, not my Flickr name, then that's something you could just cure. If you haven't done it, if you haven't attributed, then in theory, you either have to have a justification for why you've used it, such as fair use, or you're just a regular infringer. And so if you're just a regular copyright infringer, then in theory, you could get sued. In practice, in most situations, people would send a demand letter and say, please take this down or whatever. But so failure to attribute does mean you haven't done your part of the license. So I think that it's a requirement, but it's also something where you can reasonably meet your obligations by attributing to the username or whoever said it in the moment.
I would add, this is one of the reasons we focus a lot on working with platforms to add sort of user-facing and the content uploader-facing Creative Commons licenses. So the photos actually come with all of the metadata and the licensing and that sort of thing. Google image search has, good features when it comes to selecting the type of licensing. For photos, there's also the CC search, which is on our website, which can be really helpful. I think, the short answer is it's better safe than sorry. Use photos where there is good attribution. Use photos where you can reliably say that you've followed the protocol correctly. Unless, of course, you have a fair use exemption.
Do we have any other questions?
Barbara, or for the other moderators, would it be possible to unmute the other lines and give folks a chance to speak up if they're not in the chat?
Sure. Melanie, can you do that?
I can, but actually people can unmute themselves.
Okay.
If anybody is called in on a phone line or doesn't have the ability to unmute, send me a chat or an email and I would be happy to do it for you. But otherwise you should be good.
Right. And then we'll probably stop recording then if we're taking comments or questions verbally.